In August of 1971, a single television announcement from an American president quietly broke a promise that had held the entire world economy together for almost 3 decades. He didn't call it breaking a promise. He called it temporary. That word, temporary, turned out to mean for the rest of history. What that announcement actually did was sever the last thread connecting paper money to anything physical at all. From that moment forward, the dollar in your pocket wasn't a claim on gold sitting in a vault. It was simply trust. Trust in a government, trust in a system, trust that everyone else would keep accepting it too. Now here's why I'm telling you this today, in this particular week. Because a very senior official inside the current U.S. government recently used a phrase that historians use to describe exactly that kind of moment, a full realignment of how the global monetary system works. Not a metaphor, not a headline writer's exaggeration, his actual words. And the last time something like this happened, it created enormous winners and enormous losers, almost overnight, depending entirely on whether people understood what was coming or were caught completely by surprise. So today, grandfather to grandchild, let's sit with this slowly. Because by the end of this lesson, you'll understand exactly what a monetary realignment actually is, why one may be happening again right now, and most importantly, how a calm and prepared investor thinks about protecting themselves, without panic, without gold bug hysteria, and without pretending any of us can predict the future with certainty. Most people go their entire financial lives without ever asking a basic question. Why does money work the way it does? We accept that a dollar is worth a dollar. We accept that prices rise a little every year. We accept that the government can spend more than it collects, and somehow the system keeps running. These aren't laws of nature. They're arrangements, agreements made by people at particular moments in history that can be changed by people again. And right now, there are signs, not rumors, not conspiracy theories, but statements made openly by the people who run the U.S. Treasury, that a meaningful change to those arrangements is already underway. The national debt is climbing toward a number so large it's almost meaningless to say out loud. Gold, which used to be considered an old man's investment, sits near record highs. Foreign countries that used to hold the bulk of their reserves in dollars have been quietly reducing that share for years. None of this means collapse is coming. I want to be very clear about that from the start, because fear sells attention, and I have no interest in selling you fear. What it does mean is that the rules under which your savings, your investments, and your retirement operate may shift in ways that reward people who understand the shift and quietly punish people who don't. So let's build the understanding piece by piece, the way you'd build a stone wall, one layer at a time, nothing skipped, nothing rushed. Picture a small New England town in the winter of 1944. The biggest war the world had ever fought was finally ending. Representatives from 44 nations gathered together, exhausted, trying to design something that had never quite existed before, a stable system for international money. The arrangement they settled on was elegant in its simplicity. The U.S. dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed rate. Every other country would tie its own currency to the dollar. As long as that chain held, the entire world had one shared trusted measuring stick for value. Think of it the way a village might agree on a single trusted set of weights for the market square. Before that agreement, every merchant might bring their own scale, and nobody could be quite sure if they were getting a fair trade. Once everyone agrees to use the same trusted weight, trade flourishes, because nobody has to wonder if they're being cheated. That arrangement, built in that small town, helped fuel one of the greatest economic expansions in human history. Highways were built. Suburbs grew. An enormous middle class emerged with a kind of prosperity the world hadn't seen at that scale before. But there was a catch, and catches in finance always eventually arrive. The country holding the trusted weight had to behave responsibly. It couldn't simply produce more money than it had gold to back it, the same way a village elder holding the official scale couldn't quietly shave a little off it whenever convenient. Trust depends on restraint. And by the late 1960s, that restraint had worn thin. A costly war, expanding social programs, more dollars printed than there was gold to support them. Other nations noticed. Some of them, quite literally, asked for their gold back. So in 1971, the agreement broke. Not through some dramatic crisis, but through a calm television announcement that called the change temporary. It was not temporary. From that day forward, the dollar's value rested on nothing but confidence. Confidence in the discipline, the institutions, and the credibility of the government issuing it. It's the financial equivalent of a landlord assuring you the roof is solid while, paycheck by paycheck, quietly making decisions that erode the foundation underneath. Once money is no longer tied to anything physical, a strange and very convenient thing becomes possible for any government, spending more than it collects indefinitely by creating new money to cover the difference. Imagine a household that earns $5,000 a month but spends $7,000. For an ordinary family, that gap means hard choices. Cutting expenses, taking a second job, or borrowing in a way that eventually has to be repaid with real sacrifice. A government with the power to print its own currency has a different option entirely. It can borrow the difference and quietly create new money to make sure that debt gets purchased. The new money enters circulation. There are now more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, services, and assets that existed before. Prices slowly and steadily rise. That's inflation. And it isn't a glitch in the system. In a fiat currency world, currency backed by trust rather than gold, a small steady level of inflation is essentially baked into how the system survives. Here's the part that matters most for your own financial life. Inflation doesn't affect everyone equally. If your wealth sits mostly in cash and savings, you experience pure erosion. Your money buys a little less each year, quietly, the way a wooden fence loses strength to weather even when nothing dramatic happens. But if your wealth sits in assets, property, businesses, productive investments, scarce resources, those tend to rise in price alongside inflation because they're priced in the very currency that's being diluted. This is the part my grandfather used to put simply: the system has a gentle, ongoing tendency to move wealth from people who hold cash to people who hold assets. It's not a scandal, it's just the mechanics. But understanding the mechanics changes what you choose to hold. So what exactly does it mean when a senior government official says the system is being realigned? It's not abstract. There are specific, concrete moves being discussed and pursued. The first move is a deliberate effort to weaken the currency. This sounds backwards to people who assume a strong dollar is always good. But a currency that's too strong makes a country's exports expensive and its domestic manufacturing uncompetitive. There's historical precedent for this. In the mid-1980s, several major economies coordinated to deliberately bring the dollar down because it had become so strong it was hollowing out American manufacturing. Something similar is being discussed again, using trade policy and diplomatic pressure rather than a formal multinational agreement. What does that mean practically? If the dollar weakens meaningfully, anything you buy from abroad, foreign goods, foreign travel, becomes more expensive. But domestically produced goods become more price competitive against imports, which theoretically supports manufacturing jobs at home. There's a trade-off baked into the strategy, and like most trade-offs in economics, somebody pays for the benefit somebody else receives. The second move involves loosening some of the banking regulations put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. The argument in favor is that it becomes cheaper and easier for banks, especially smaller community banks, to lend money, which helps small businesses and local economies. The argument of concern is straightforward too. Those regulations existed precisely because under-regulated lending is what caused the 2008 crisis in the first place. Loosening the rules doesn't guarantee a repeat, but it does increase the range of possible outcomes, and not always toward the better ones. The third move involves reshaping global trade relationships, using tariffs as leverage to encourage manufacturing to return domestically, alongside a stated goal of higher domestic energy production. The aim, broadly, is faster economic growth, controlled deficits, and reduced dependence on foreign manufacturing and energy. The honest cost of that strategy, in the near term, tends to be higher prices for consumers before any of the long-term benefits materialize, if they materialize at all. Put together, these three moves aren't speculation about what might happen. They're publicly stated policy direction from people who genuinely have the authority to pursue them. There's a useful historical mirror for what's happening today, and it isn't 1944, it's the years immediately following 1971. When the dollar's link to gold broke, almost nobody fully understood in the moment what it would mean. Some people simply went on living exactly as before, keeping their savings in cash, trusting that money would behave the way it always had. Others, and this group ended up far better off over the following decade, recognized that a currency no longer anchored to anything physical was a currency more vulnerable to inflation and shifted meaningfully into hard assets, property, gold, productive businesses. The decade that followed was brutal for cash savers. Inflation in the United States ran into the double digits at points during the 1970s. Someone holding cash in a savings account during that period didn't just fail to grow their wealth, they watched its real purchasing power get cut dramatically, year after year, even while the number printed on their bank statement stayed perfectly stable. The people who came through that decade in strong financial shape weren't necessarily smarter. They were positioned differently before the shift happened because they understood, even vaguely, that the rules had changed. This is the historical pattern worth remembering. Financial system shifts don't usually punish people because the shift itself was catastrophic. They punish people because of the gap between when the rules actually changed and when those people noticed. When experienced investors think about a moment like this, they don't try to predict exactly how it unfolds, because nobody can. Instead, they think in terms of scenarios and positioning. Some investors believe the most likely outcome is a gradual, managed adjustment. The dollar drifts lower over years rather than collapsing. Trade relationships slowly rebalance, manufacturing returns incrementally, and markets simply adapt the way they always eventually do. Under this view, patience and diversification carry you through comfortably. Others believe pressure is building faster than policymakers can manage cleanly, and that the transition could arrive with more volatility, sharper currency moves, stickier inflation, more turbulent markets along the way. Under this view, having genuine protection in place matters more than trying to optimize for the smoothest outcome. The important lesson isn't picking which camp will be proven right. It's recognizing that a thoughtful portfolio should be reasonably comfortable in either scenario. You're not trying to predict the weather perfectly. You're making sure your house can handle a storm if one comes, while still being a pleasant place to live if it doesn't. There's also a meaningful nuance that gets missed constantly. People assume that owning U.S. stocks means 100% exposure to the U.S. dollar and the U.S. economy specifically. That's often not true. Many of the largest American companies generate a substantial share of their revenue overseas, in other currencies, from other economies. Owning them already provides a kind of built-in geographic diversification that most people don't realize they have. So what does this actually mean for how you manage your own money? A few frameworks worth holding on to. The first risk to recognize is what I'd call the comfort of cash. Sitting entirely in a savings account feels safe because the number never seems to go down. But if inflation runs ahead of the interest your cash is earning, and historically, it very often does, your purchasing power erodes quietly every single year, with nothing dramatic ever appearing to alert you to it. Your grandparents may have been taught that a savings account was the responsible, conservative choice. In a world where currency value is being deliberately managed downward, conservative cash can quietly become one of the riskier choices available. The second risk is concentration without realizing it. Before assuming you're entirely exposed to one currency or one economy, look at where the businesses you actually own generate their revenue. You may already have more geographic balance than you think, simply by owning well-diversified, internationally active companies. The third risk, and this one trips up even experienced people, is the temptation to time the transition perfectly, waiting for the ideal moment to act. The cleanest entry point, the most obvious signal, often means waiting indefinitely while the world quietly moves on without you. History shows repeatedly that being approximately right and positioned early beats being precisely right and positioned too late. As for where opportunity tends to sit during currency realignments, hard assets like precious metals and productive real estate have historically served as a form of insurance against currency erosion, not because they generate growth in the way a business does, but because they tend to hold their value when paper currency doesn't. Domestic manufacturing and energy production tend to benefit when trade and currency policy deliberately favors them. And markets in other countries with strong, real, exportable resources sometimes benefit when global money flows away from a single dominant currency. A simple test worth applying to anything you're considering owning. Could you explain, in plain language, to a curious 12-year-old exactly why you own it and what would have to happen for it to do well? If you can't answer that clearly, that's worth sitting with before committing real money. Here's the thing, nobody tells you clearly enough about moments like this. The rules of money have changed before. They will change again. They changed quietly in 1944, abruptly in 1971, and they appear to be shifting once more right now. In every one of those moments, two groups of people emerged. One group kept doing exactly what they'd always done, trusting that yesterday's rules would continue indefinitely. The other group paid attention, adjusted gradually, and came through the other side considerably stronger. The difference between those two groups was rarely intelligence. It was preparation. It was the willingness to ask quiet, unglamorous questions before the crowd was asking them loudly. You don't need to predict the future with precision. Nobody can, and anyone promising otherwise is selling you something. What you need is a portfolio built sensibly enough that it can absorb whichever version of the future actually arrives. The smooth one or the rocky one, sure, without putting your peace of mind or your family's future at the mercy of a single bet. The market and the monetary system underneath it will keep doing what they've always done, rewarding the patient, the diversified, and the prepared, far more reliably than they reward the clever or the lucky. Let's gather this together. The global financial system built 80 years ago in a small New Hampshire town is being quietly restructured by the very people responsible for running it. That's not speculation. It's stated policy. A weaker currency by design, lighter banking regulation, a deliberate push to reshape global trade, and central banks around the world steadily accumulating gold all at once. None of that calls for fear. It calls for attention, and for a sensible, honest look at how your own money is positioned. Know what you own. Understand what would need to happen for it to do well. Keep enough diversification that no single outcome can hurt you badly, and resist the urge to either panic or to do absolutely nothing, because both of those are simply different ways of refusing to think. The market has always rewarded patience and preparation far more generously than it rewards prediction. If lessons like this one, slow, careful, built to last rather than built to go viral, are useful to you, you know where to find us. Subscribe to Grandpa's Finance Class. We'll keep building this understanding together, one quiet lesson at a time. We'll see you in the next one. Stay safe.